Well, that's some music to get us pumping here this morning. Hello, and welcome to the competition series. Throughout this four-part series, we're exploring how competition propels our country and world toward a brighter future of growth, solutions, and opportunity. These conversations will dive deeper into some of the themes we began to unpack last week during the 2022 State of American Business event. Today's focus is on the competition for global leadership. Winning the future means competing in global markets and competing for global leadership. From a robust trade agenda, supply chain resilience, and a tough stance on cybersecurity, to technology leadership and innovations to solve global problems, we must make sure government policy is supporting competition, not holding it back. Our first conversation today will address the global trade landscape and what it means for the American business community. Then we'll examine the state of security in an interconnected world, and we'll conclude today's program with a look ahead at the future of artificial intelligence and innovation in our economy. We hope these discussions will help equip and inform you for the challenges and opportunities that will define a new economic era, spurred by competition and led by business. Enjoy the program.
Good morning. I'm John Murphy. I'm Senior Vice President for International Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. In this first segment, we'll examine the top issues facing American companies as they do business around the world, trading, investing, doing business in foreign markets. What happens overseas matters back here. Why? Because 80% of the world's purchasing power is in the hands of consumers outside the United States. For the Fortune 500, half of all revenue today comes from exports or foreign operations. And for small businesses, well, 97% of American exporters are small businesses. Now, the competition for international markets is fierce, but American business is ready for it. However, business needs our government to enact good policies that will sharpen the ability of American companies to compete and win in global markets. Trade policies that will help American workers, farmers, and companies to access foreign markets, tax policies that don't put American firms at a cost disadvantage, regulatory policies that don't tie American firms up in knots while our competitors race ahead. Now, to dig into this, we have four U.S. Chamber experts, all senior vice presidents in our International Affairs Division. Charles Freeman leading our Asia Department, Marjorie Chorlins leading our Europe Department, Scott Eisner, who leads our U.S. Africa Business Center, and Neil Harrington, leading our Americas Department. Charles, let's start with Asia, and let's go straight to perhaps the biggest question. What's next for the U.S.-China relationship? The so-called Phase 1 deal that was concluded 2 years ago has lapsed with mixed results, but the tariffs are all still there, tariffs covering more than $300 billion of U.S. imports. What's the Biden administration planning to do, and what does U.S. business think we should do?
Well, U.S. business, thanks, John. It's great to be with you. Great to be with all of you this morning. U.S. business is, as a general rule, largely wants certainty in the U.S. trade relationship with China. There are 1.4 billion consumers. It continues to be a fast and growing market for American exporters and investors in the marketplace. So, the business community wants clarity about what the administration and the U.S. government wants to do. Sure, there are some very important questions of security, human rights, and other issues which have a dramatic impact on the trade relationship, but by and large, the trade relationship has been enormously good for the United States with China, and the question, despite all the challenges, is how can we make it better? And there are multiple structural issues that exists, notwithstanding the lapsing of the Phase 1 agreement. We continue to believe that the Phase 1 agreement and Phase 1 approach is important and should continue. But by and large, we're looking for the administration to move forward on addressing structural issues in the relationship, and that has yet to materialize.
Yeah, Charles, what's a good example of one of those structural issues in China that U.S. business cares about?
Well, a significant issue is Chinese domestic support for their own companies, state-owned and otherwise, in international markets, and that creates a distorted competitive landscape for Americans and other foreign companies in not just China but globally. So, getting to the bottom of how we treat these preferences that Chinese companies have in not only their own market but in overseas markets is fundamental to how we deal with China in the future.
Charles, elsewhere in the Asia Pacific, there was news this January of a giant new trade agreement coming into force, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And of course, there's the old Trans-Pacific Partnership that the U.S. helped lead, but then we withdrew from it. It sounds like there's a lot of action on the trade front in the Asia Pacific. But what does that mean for the United States?
Well, unfortunately, we've largely been on the sidelines, and since the unfortunate withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership back in 2017, the United States has largely stood still in our trade approach to other countries, and if not stood still, actually moved backwards in some cases by making trade that much more difficult. And particularly given the pandemic and the supply chain challenges that emerged from that, there's a lot that needs to be done to get us back to some sort of competitive parity with China and with other countries that are moving forward with their trade policies in not just the Indo-Pacific but globally. So well, we need to get in the game, and unfortunately at this point it's not clear when we will be able to do that.
Charles, on that front, there's a lot of talk in Washington about a possible digital trade agreement. What's your take on that?
Well, a digital agreement would be very important for not just U.S. High tech firms, but also, as you mentioned, the hundreds of thousands of small and medium sized businesses that are exporters and would benefit from more clear rules with respect to digital trade in markets outside the United States. And so a digital agreement should be fundamental. And as the administration rolls out its economic framework with respect to the Indo-Pacific, a digital agreement has to be front and center in that effort.
Thanks, Charles. Turning to Europe now, Marjorie Chorlins. U.S. relations with Europe probably improved more than with any other world region last year. We saw some long-running trade disputes settled. The Biden pledge to work with allies. We've probably seen that play out more with Europe than anywhere else. What's your take for the year ahead?
Thanks, John. Great to be with you. You're absolutely right. The Biden administration certainly invested last year in improving what had become a very fractious relationship with Europe, and they've made some important strides in that regard. You referenced a couple of major disputes that are on the road to resolution. They also established the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council as a formal platform to work together in establishing standards for emerging technologies, hopefully avoiding other disputes, and being able to work together to address some of the big global challenges we have. We have seen more cooperation, and we will see more cooperation with Europe this year, especially on things like climate. Hopefully working more closely with Europe in addressing some of those structural challenges that Charles mentioned when he was talking about China. But we're also going to have to reckon with the fact that Europe is moving in a direction when it comes to digital policy that isn't necessarily good for our member companies. So that's an issue that very much bears focusing on. One last point I'd mention, the UK is no longer part of the European Union, but they obviously are still very much a part of the UK, of Europe, sorry. And the fact is, where we have resolved or are on the road to resolving our steel and aluminum dispute with Europe, we haven't done that with the UK. We also have some US-UK free trade agreement negotiations that have been put on hold since the arrival of the Biden administration, and that's something we'd like to see resume as well.
Yes, that's certainly a priority we hear about from the business community. Marjorie, let's dig a little further into what you're saying about big tech. The EU is taking on so-called big tech in some major ways on the antitrust front, on regulation. But when we hear European officials talk about big tech, they seem to be really talking about U.S. tech. What are the stakes for the American business community?
Thanks, John. Look, the Europeans, during the course of this latest von der Leyen Commission, have basically identified technological sovereignty as one of their priorities. Now, what do they mean by technological sovereignty? Effectively, they mean creating space for European companies to become more competitive in digital and advanced technologies. The question is how they're going about doing that. And from our perspective, it looks like Europeans have decided that rather than trying to win the race themselves, they're going to make it tougher for some American companies to compete effectively. And that's something we can't let stand. I would say there's one other issue also of importance in particular to small and medium-sized exporters, and that is concerns about the legal certainty that allow for data flows between the US and Europe. The European courts have struck down some of the measures that we use to allow for those data flows. And frankly, it's tough for companies to know whether they are in compliance with Europe's data privacy laws until we get a resolution.
Yes, very important to get a successor to Privacy Shield in place. Marjorie, one of the chief hopes for transatlantic cooperation has been in the area of climate change and energy security. What's the outlook there?
Well, this is interesting. This is an area where we actually have seen some important cooperation. The US and Europe really led aggressively on things like methane emissions and a pledge for reforestation in that run-up to the big COP26 conference in Glasgow last year. We have a solid foundation on things like this, and as a result, we think we should be able to work together more effectively going forward. Part of that Trade and Technology Council that I mentioned a few minutes ago does speak to green technology cooperation. How can we work together to develop the solutions we're going to need to achieve the green transition that both Europe and the United States are placing a lot of emphasis on?
Terrific. Scott Eisner, let's turn to Africa. Scott, in recent years, U.S. business has really taken notice of Africa in new ways. Maybe it's because there's 1 billion consumers there, a growing market, a young market, and their purchasing power has been rising a great deal. How do you see the opportunities?
Thanks very much, John. The opportunities are expansive, right? By 2050, Nigeria's population will be larger than the United States. By 2050, you'll have about 2.5 billion people living on the continent. So I think it's very similar to what we've heard about other areas in the digital landscape. I think is probably primarily one of the big focus areas we see coming from a COVID environment forward. We've seen a lot of youthful expansion of utilizing digital services and bringing new imports in the continent, but also connecting African products to the world. And I think that's really an important area as we've seen some of the supply chain challenges globally is how do we work in concert with our partners on the continent to build those long-lasting supply chains that bring down some of those barriers that we've seen at physical borders over time, and perhaps trade in digital goods and services will help to expand opportunities for this very youthful, bulging population that's sure to make Africa rise in so many more important ways than we've seen in the last century.
Scott, when it comes to trade policy, how do you see the big priorities here in Washington? There's AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, trade preference program covering a large swath of Africa. There's the free trade agreement negotiations with Kenya launched in the last administration, but which the Biden administration seems reluctant to take up. And then, of course, there's this big project in Africa, the African Continental Free Trade Area, where trade barriers are being swept away amongst African countries. The U.S. isn't a part of that, but U.S. business, it creates opportunities for them as well. Where would you see the focus from the U.S. business community?
Yeah, thanks, John. It's really transitional, right? We know that AGOA by 2025 will live in 25 years of an established trade preference program, really helping African nations gain access to the U.S. market, hasn't done as much to help American companies gain access to African markets, but it has created a lot of job and wealth creation on the continent, which clearly leads to a growth of consumer needs. So I think it's been very beneficial, but we need to reevaluate how that has implications for access for American companies onto the continent. And I think AGOA will go through a transitional period over the next 3 years as we lead towards 2025. The FTA, I think, was a seminal point in U.S.-Africa relations writ large, but it showed that we were willing to put some skin in the game, that we were really willing to delve deeper into bilateral relationships on the continent and how that might have a positive net impact on regional bodies such as the East Africa community. And we hadn't had a FTA with or discussions around an FTA with an African government since Morocco over a decade ago. So I think that we need to still continue to move forward on the FTA with Kenya. It's an important milestone in our relationship with bilateral relationships on the continent. But we should always have in our front view mirror, not necessarily our rear view mirror, the opportunities that are before us. And that's where really the AFC FTA comes into play. They're going to be negotiating customs duties. There's negotiations around digital chapters. And as you heard from both Marjorie and Charles, and as I mentioned previously, the digital era is upon us. And how do regulatory harmony around the digital space on the continent make new opportunities for American companies? And I think Marjorie hit on a point that's not just true for the European Union. It's true of how we see the European Union engaging in Africa. And that's really to help push American companies on their back foot on the technology space. And I think that's something we need to be hyper aware of. And that's where things like AGOA and potential bilateral negotiations can reevaluate and level the playing field for American companies vis-a-vis Europe, but also Turkey, China, and elsewhere.
Thanks, Scott. Neil Harrington, turning to our neighborhood here, the Americas. I was looking at the stats. I see Mexico and Canada are the top 2 U.S. trading partners, and Mexico is just barely ahead of Canada. And we have a new modernized trade agreement with these 2 neighbors, USMCA. It's a year and a half old. Trade's rising, but we seem to have a bunch of trade disputes emerging. In Mexico, there's questions about energy, ag, biotech, customs. In Canada, the Canadians have apparently proposed a digital services tax, even though at the OECD there was a pledge not to move forward with those. And then here in the U.S., our 2 neighbors are challenging the U.S. approach to rules of origin for autos. What's going on here? It sounds like quite a lot of discontent about this under this new trade agreement.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. Look, I think the top line you mentioned is critical. We could potentially see, the numbers aren't quite in, but we could see in 2021 the highest level of U.S. goods trades with Canada and Mexico ever. And I think that's really remarkable when you consider we've dealt with 2 years of supply chain dislocations across the continent, as well as 2 borders closed to non-essential travel. But you're absolutely right. We have under the surface these lurking trade irritants, kind of twofold. I'd talk about Canada first in the sense very briefly. Each side, the U.S. and Canada, have issues on which they can both offer concessions and they can achieve wins. There's absolutely room there for negotiation, I believe. The challenges with Mexico, I view as more vexing because you have, as many of our members know who are watching today, you have a Mexican president who's long championed state-centric economic policy at the expense of private enterprise. And his party also controls both houses of Congress. And this point is really important. The president has also shown that he wants to avoid confrontations with the U.S. at all costs. So I think we see the Biden administration engage Mexico this year on these issues for 3 key reasons. First, USTR and the administration have committed to enforcing USMCA. And as you say, John, many of the irritants constitute likely USMCA violations. Second, we're all aware of the priority the administration is placing on addressing climate change, and what Mexico proposes to do in the energy sphere directly undermines U.S. objectives on climate policy. And third, and more broadly, the continued deterioration of Mexico's investment climate poses risks of both capital flight and job loss that the administration simply can't ignore because of how quickly they could morph into national security challenges. So these are all issues that we're really focused on engaging the administration and hope to see them meaningfully engage the Mexican government this year.
Yeah, Neil, listening to you, I'm reminded of something Chairman Richie Neal of House Ways and Means said during the USMCA negotiations. He he would always say enforcement, enforcement, enforcement. That was the priority coming into this. And it sounds like USTR has its work cut out for it as an organization, as an agency, to enforce this agreement.
No question about that.
Turning our eyes southward, it appears that Brazil's economy is recovering after a long recession. They appear to be coming out of the pandemic better than some countries, thanks to a pretty effective vaccination effort. And they have a big election later this year. What's your outlook on Brazil?
Yeah, it's a great question because big elections are what we're focused on across the hemisphere this year. All eyes are indeed on this election, the second largest economy, obviously, in the Western Hemisphere. And what will really, I think, determine its outcome is the pace of pandemic recovery. Brazil, as a lot of our members know or watching, is a deeply polarized country. And current President Jair Bolsonaro is a very controversial figure, in no small part because of how the public perceives his handling of the pandemic. His chief rival, former President Luiz Inácio da Silva, who a lot of us know well, is currently polling with a double-digit lead, but it's still very early. So you mentioned Brazil's high vaccination rate, John. It's a critical component of this. It's one of the highest rates of full vaccination in the world, 67%. This could drive a quick recovery, which could obviously favor the incumbent. So in a word, I think we need to expect the unexpected going forward. There are likely to be a lot of twists and turns in this journey before Brazilians go to the polls in October. What's critical to us, bottom line, is that the next government continue prioritizing pro-growth reforms and closer U.S. trade ties. It's a message we're sharing with all candidates because we've seen the results in strong jobs growth in Brazil and in economic growth in general.
Terrific. I'd like to pose really a question for all of you and hear your response. You know, you're standard bearers for the U.S. business community. I'd like to hear your top recommendation for the Biden administration in terms of trade and investment policy between the U.S. and the region you're working with. Charles?
Thanks, John. I think the first thing I would recommend is that the administration settle on a China policy. How do they actually want to work with China? What is the line between acceptable commercial policy for security purposes and not? And then I think you need to have a more robust approach and more substantive approach to trade policy with the Indo-Pacific. I think that from a strategic point of view, not having a genuine comprehensive economic framework in place with respect to the Indo-Pacific basically cripples any strategic effort that you want to have so that the United States can be, quote, back and a leader in Asia and provide a meaningful alternative to competition from China. So I think those are the two things I would jump at, and I think I'll reiterate my urge to the administration to get in the game because the time's a wasting.
Yeah, very good. Marjorie, what's your top recommendation?
Thanks, John. Well, practically speaking, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you one. Let's face it, the transatlantic relationship is the largest commercial relationship in the world, $6 trillion in two-way trade and investment. So we've got a number of facets that we need to work on this year. I'd say number one would be to secure some tangible outcomes from that Trade and Technology Council that I mentioned. We need to see some continuous progress in the relationship. It's one thing to resolve outstanding disputes, but it's another thing to move forward on new agreements, on how to manage emerging technologies and things like that. Second, we'd like to see progress here again, partly through the TTC, on a joint European U.S. Approach to China's practices, unfair practices, both at home and abroad. Perhaps the most important thing we need to see vis-a-vis Europe from the administration is for them to stand up and speak out more vocally, more publicly, articulating the concerns they have about the direction of travel on Europe's digital policies. They need to speak out against the discriminatory aspects of some of those proposals. They need to speak out about the importance of due process and about the importance of effective IP protections. These are the kinds of issues that are at stake when we talk about the challenge from Europe's drive to become more competitive in the digital space. And then lastly, I would say we've got to see a restart to the US-UK talks. Practically speaking, Iceland has more trade agreements than the United States does. There are some really obvious, easy ones that we should be able to bring to closure. We had negotiations between the US and UK underway before the election. Those were put on hold. This should be an easy a negotiation to get back to. A lot of ground was covered previously. This is our closest ally. Let's get a deal done.
Indeed, you'd think it would be easy. So a priority for the year ahead. Scott Eisner, what's your top recommendation?
Number 1, 2, and 3 has to be presidential leadership in the Africa space. Of all the presidents we've had, there are 54 countries across the continent. We have only had presidents visit 18 countries on the continent through our history, which is not the greatest track record on earth. When you look at the Chinese, whose top leadership have had over 80 visits to 43 different countries across the continent. First and foremost, we need to be in the game. As Charles said, we haven't had presidential leadership around Africa for quite some time. And if the Biden-Harris administration wants to see growth with new markets and support democracies around the world, we need to support strong economies. So for me, the top of the list is President Biden and Vice President Harris's commitment to expanding opportunities with African nations and leaning back into the Kenya FTA and figuring out ways we can support the growth of the African Continental Free Trade Area.
Thanks, Scott. That's great. Neil, what's your top recommendation? Bring us home.
Yeah, John, this one's an easy one for me. First, we have the opportunity to host the first Summit of the Americas in the U.S. since 1994. We as the Chamber will play a significant role in the private sector components of this. It is the best opportunity we will have as public and private sectors to build regional consensus around pro-growth policies for an inclusive health and economic recovery. There are no two ways about it. You gather all 30 plus hemispheric leaders in one place. We will absolutely have the opportunity to drive consensus. But we need from the administration very quickly confirmation of a date and location of the summit so we can get to work on building a very ambitious agenda.
Neil and the rest of you, thank you very much for your insightful comments. Appreciate it today. We'll continue the conversation now. I'd like to welcome Chris Roberti, a Senior Vice President here at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for a conversation on building security across the globe. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Christopher Roberti, Senior Vice President at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. My team and I cover national security issues to include cybersecurity, supply chain security, space, and government procurement. I'm pleased to be speaking today with Michael Morrell, former Acting Director and Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Michael also is a published author, a commentator, successful business person, and the host of the outstanding podcast, Intelligence Matters. Michael and I are going to speak about a few of the main geostrategic challenges for the United States and how great power competition is impacting America's leadership in the areas of cyber, supply chain, and space. So let's get right to it. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Chris, it is great to be with you, and it's always great to be with the Chamber. So let's get to it, as you said.
Yeah, well, first of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the happenings in Eastern Europe, particularly with respect to Ukraine and Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin is holding Ukraine at risk again, both with his statements and the presence of 100,000 troops on three sides of the Russia-Ukraine border. How do we get here, and why are we here?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we're here because Vladimir Putin believes, and he really believes this. These aren't just talking points, rhetorical talking points. He really believes this. He believes that NATO on or near his borders is a strategic threat to Russia. And I think you have to, to really understand that, you have to understand Russian history and how many times Russia has been invaded by one adversary or another that has created this mindset that they have. And so what he has done is he's put 100,000 troops, as you said, on Ukraine's border, and he is basically trying to extort from the West a pledge that Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO, and that there be some long-term deal between Russia and NATO regarding who's allowed to join and who's not. And he's holding them hostage, right, with these 100,000 troops on the border, and not so subtly threatening to invade unless he gets what he wants. In return, the West, led by the United States, but strongly supported by the United Kingdom and most of Europe, and by NATO, has said, look, we're not going to back down on the concept that every country gets to determine its own security path. That's not negotiable. As you know, there are talks underway. We'll see what comes out of those talks. Maybe we can give something that will satisfy him. But what we can't give, right, is we can't give up Ukraine in these discussions. And we've also said to him, look, if you invade, we are going to impose on you the strongest of sanctions. And I think, when people hear that, they should think North Korea type sanctions, Iran type sanctions, where U.S. firms and U.S. financial institutions are not only not allowed to do business with Russia, but any country in the world doing business with Russia wouldn't be able to do business with a U.S. company. So, very harsh sanctions. This is a standoff. Hard to see how it's going to turn out, but it is an extraordinarily dangerous situation, Chris.
Yeah, and it seems again that U.S. credibility is on the line yet again, and the Russians are notoriously tough, and so when they seem to not be bowed by the threat of sanctions. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how that unfolds. And in your mind, in your experience, how does Putin run his risk-reward calculation on something like this?
Yeah, so he tries to pretend that he's the great strategic chess master, a guy who sits there and has thought 10 steps ahead. That's not who he is. He is a type of person who takes a step, sees how people react to it, sees reactions in general, then decides on his next step. So I don't think sitting here today that he's decided what he's going to do. I think he's going to wait and see how these negotiations go. He is going to think about, how serious is the United States in terms of these sanctions, and perhaps even more importantly, the UK. He probably figures the UK will follow, but he's probably betting, Chris, that the EU, like it did in 2014, is going to have a big debate about whether or not to impose sanctions, and at the end of the day, not, right? Which would significantly reduce the economic cost on him if the EU does not follow suit. So he's playing this day by day, which actually makes it a little bit more dangerous, right, than if he's thought the thing carefully through.
Yeah, and I think you alluded to it. I mean, Europe is very dependent on Russia for a lot of its energy supplies, and we have the recently being built Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That's another potential bargaining chip on our side, but it's a very serious situation. Looking at the business side, how should U.S. companies and allied companies be thinking about developments there? I don't imagine there's a tremendous amount of direct foreign investment, relatively speaking, in Ukraine vis-a-vis other parts of the world, but it still is a very important part of the world. And how should U.S. companies be thinking about what's going to happen? And if the U.S. were to take steps in allied countries against Russia, should companies be thinking that they may expect more cyber attacks from Russia or cyber gangs located in Russia, something like that?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's three buckets here, right? The first bucket is Ukraine itself. If Putin invades, he'll have to make a decision about, does he take just the predominantly Russian-speaking provinces in the far eastern part of Ukraine, or does he take the entirety of eastern Ukraine all the way up to the Dnieper River, which is all the way up to Kiev, which essentially would cut Ukraine in half? There's not a lot of Western investment in eastern Ukraine. There's more in the Kiev area. If I were a company and I had a presence in Kiev, I'd be thinking about how do I get my people out if the Russians invade? Because I think, while I don't think Putin's going to take Kiev itself, Kiev could be under risk of long-range missile strikes and of Russian aircraft strikes. So I'd be thinking about, how do I get them out? How do I protect them? So that's one. The second is, how do U.S. companies, what will happen with U.S. companies who are doing business in Russia today? Because Russia's not Iran or North Korea, where there's very few U.S. companies who were doing business there before the imposition of sanctions. There are hundreds of U.S. companies doing business in Russia. So will the U.S. government give those companies time to wind down their business when we impose sanctions, or will those sanctions take effect immediately? Right. I think that's something that the administration needs to think about in terms of the imposition of sanctions, but companies need to think about that too. And then there's that third bucket you talked about, which is cyber. I think if Putin invades Ukraine and we impose the harsh sanctions that we're talking about, I think you will see increased Russian cyber attacks in the US. Not necessarily significant attacks on our infrastructure, because I think Putin fears that we would see that as an act of war, but just harassment attacks. I really do think that would be in the cards, Chris.
Yeah, well, thank you. Let's those are all really important and thought-provoking topics, and I'd like to shift a little to supply chains, because in a way it's a little bit related. It talks about global transport of goods and services, but throughout the pandemic, we've seen the global supply chains stretch to capacity in different iterations. Everything from trying to get PPE to the backups at the ports that we saw last 6 months and continuing. How do companies balance the competition for efficiency, speed, and lean cost structures with the need for robust, resilient, and dependable supply chains? And how do we make sure that companies have the inputs they need for things like semiconductors and advanced pharmaceuticals in a world that's getting increasingly more challenging?
Yeah. So I think we're in a new world. I don't think this is just COVID related. I think the supply chain issue is a long-term issue. I think, Chris, that there's three dynamics driving people's focus on supply chains, people's focus on vulnerabilities. And one is the geostrategic competition that we find ourselves in today. It's not just, it's primarily China and the United States, but it's bigger than that, right? It is the US and Russia, it's the US and China, it's Japan and China outside the context of the US, it's India and China outside the context of the US, it's Europe and Russia, it's Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's a lot of places where there's this geostrategic competition. And in all of that, everybody is looking at their supply chains and they don't like what they see, because they see vulnerabilities with the geostrategic competition that they're facing. And everybody's taking steps to reduce those vulnerabilities, right? So huge focus on supply chains and huge focus on reducing your vulnerability. That's one. The second is the world's an increasingly unstable place. And whether you're talking about Colombia's concerns about Venezuela or attacks on Saudi Arabia from Yemen, right? That's also in a number of different places around the world. People are worried about instability and what that means for their ability. The Russia-Ukraine example is a great example, right? If you source products from Ukraine, you got to worry about that, right? So people are focused on their supply chains for that reason as well, because of this concern about instability. And then the last reason, which relates to the first in some way, is the incredibly rapid technological change that's occurring. And that's not going to stop, right? It's only going to continue to accelerate. And many, many countries in the world are looking at those technologies and they're saying to themselves, look, these technologies are going to determine future economic success and future military success, future intelligence success. So we want to have our own microelectronics industry. We want to have our own 5G industry, right? And on and on and on and on. So that's also driving the supply chain pressure. The answer to your question is, how do you achieve both the efficiencies of, just-in-time delivery? I think the government has a huge role here to play. I know there are people on the Hill who think about this every day. I know the Chamber does. But we need a kind of industrial policy that we had at the beginning of the Cold War, where the government helps make the investments that take some risk off the table and leverage private capital to build the supply chains that reduce our vulnerability while still preserving the just-in-time the just-in-time economic system that is so important to business.
Oh, thank you. It is a significant technological challenge, and we do know that companies like Samsung and others are building and doing a lot in the United States, and will continue to do so. On the scope of technology, let's shift quickly to space.
Yeah.
Space is an area that there's a lot going on, and probably more than people are aware. In particular, we know that there's rockets going up and there's satellites and space stations, but really there's a lot more going on, and there's a whole other domain, the military domain of space, and that's sort of crashing together with the commercial end, where, for example, we saw the Russian anti-satellite tests of last year create space debris that impacts commercial satellites and commercial openings. So how should the U.S. and U.S. companies think about and work together to collaborate and A, capture the economic and strategic benefits of space, and B, collaborate on some of the security aspects of it, much like they do on cybersecurity issues?
Two revolutions underway in space. One is military, and revolution is a strong word, but that's exactly what's happening on the military side. So the Chinese and the Russians know that the United States relies significantly on space for both intelligence and for military communications. And their plan is, if they ever go to war with the United States, is to use their anti-satellite weapons that they're developing to blow our national intelligence and national military satellites literally out of the sky. And we're trying to build similar systems. We're trying to build systems that defend satellites from anti-satellite weapons. So there's a whole revolution going on there. And there's also a revolution on the commercial side. Each year sees more and more commercial satellites being launched into space, right? It's in a couple hundred every year now. So there are literally thousands of commercial satellites. They're so much cheaper than they've ever been before. And this is all really positive, because these satellites will allow products and services to be provided to people that were not possible before. This is a very good thing. 5G from space is going to be a reality, for example. The ability for a pipeline company to have a satellite every day scan its pipeline looking for even the smallest of leaks is incredibly important to that company and incredibly important to the environment. So all sorts of positives. But the downside is that space, particularly what we call LEO, low Earth orbit, is becoming extraordinarily crowded. with small satellites. And there is a risk of these satellites bumping into each other. And when that happens, satellites breaking up and creating more debris and more collisions. So what we need is an international set of standards, set of norms, an international agreement for how the commercialization of space is going to work. And we need some understanding of what are kind of the norms in the intelligence business from space and the military business in space, right? What's acceptable and what's not. And I really think the United States has to lead those discussions if they're going to happen. If you think, Chris, about the airline industry and the fact that an aircraft can land anywhere in the world, air traffic control is the same everywhere in the world. Planes have to meet certain standards. That's what we need. That's what we need in space. In fact, we need an air traffic control system for low Earth orbit. And that's going to take a set of international negotiations. And again, the United States is going to be the one to have to lead it.
Thank you very much for your time, Michael, today.
You're welcome.
I think you and I could have 3 more sessions of this and
Right.
still scratch the surface. So I really appreciate your time. It's a fascinating conversation. And I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Jordan Crenshaw.
Thank you, Chris. In the State of American Business Address, we heard loud and clear that it is critical for the United States to compete on a global scale. Technological innovation is one of the key ingredients to ensure America has the tools to lead. From the internet revolution to wireless connectivity infrastructure like 5G, the nation that leads in innovation is best positioned to lead the world for the coming decades. Perhaps the most critical technology for the U.S. to maintain leadership in is artificial intelligence. AI is already contributing to growth, from developing vaccines for COVID-19 to promoting economic inclusion through the use of inclusion scores and expanding access to credit. But at the same time, many challenges are ahead. Last month, CTEC commissioned a poll by Teneo that found that more than 80% of Americans agree that the United States is best positioned to lead in developing an ethical framework for AI, and it is the nation that should lead in AI. We agree. And it is for that reason that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Technology Engagement Center today announces the formation and launch of a new commission on AI competitiveness, inclusion, and innovation to develop lasting recommendations to lead the AI race. Our commission will be co-chaired by former Congressman John Delaney of Maryland and Mike Ferguson of New Jersey. And both will bring together with a larger commission, a diverse group of commissioners that will work to develop durable, bipartisan policy solutions in the area of AI. I want to thank both of you, Congressman Delaney and Congressman Ferguson, for joining us today and for your leadership. And let's get right into it. We've seen a lot in pop culture of how AI is manifested in robots and androids. We've also seen commercials about companies using AI to solve business problems. We're seeing a lot of different applications in health, finance, and public safety for AI. With so many different conceptions of what AI is, how do we define AI, and why is that so important? Maybe I'll kick that off to Congressman Delaney.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and I'm very excited about the commission. I'm very excited to work with Mike and to work with the chamber on this incredibly important work. I mean, artificial intelligence is fundamentally reshaping our economic systems, our social systems, and I think increasingly our environmental systems. Put differently, it's kind of reshaping and reimagining every aspect of our society. And I think we're going to have to start thinking about artificial intelligence differently. It's not a discrete kind of technological component in the corner. It is actually kind of animating through, machine learning and computing power, and broadly artificial intelligence is kind of animating every aspect of our life. And like most technological innovation, it has the opportunity to be profoundly positive. And I think some of the examples you've mentioned, and there are many others, are a great example of that. But that's kind of how I think about it. I think about it as the smart technology that is enabling all aspects of our society and reimagining all aspects of our society ultimately has the opportunity to be extraordinarily positive, like innovation has always been. But it's a two-way street, and there are things we have to be thinking about from a policy perspective or regulatory perspective to ensure that it benefits as many people as possible, and that inherent biases that exist in our society do not get effectively embedded in these new systems that will be part and parcel of every interaction we have in kind of a commercial context. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, and I think that's right. It's so fundamentally important that we get definitions right, because we have to get those right in order to tackle the policy areas that this commission is looking at addressing. And Congressman Ferguson, what are some of the key issues that the commission hopes to tackle?
Well, first, thanks again for having me. I'm delighted to be a co-chair of the commission. And Congressman Delaney has been a leader on these issues for a long time, and it's really a pleasure to get to work with him now in our post-congressional lives. I'm really excited about the commission. I think there are really three areas that the commission needs to focus on, and I think can have a real impact on. First is how do we compete globally when it comes to artificial intelligence? Second, how do we regulate fairly when it comes to government policy or other policy? And third, how do we prepare our workforce for the future when it comes to how artificial intelligence is going to impact our economy and impact the jobs of people in our country going forward? And, I think the commission is going to get into, I hope, all of these issues. We're going to travel around the country and hear from a diverse group of stakeholders, people who care about these issues, who are experts in these issues. We're going to have field hearings around the country. We're going to kick it off in Austin, Texas in March. And, I'm hoping that we're going to hear from consumer groups and civil rights groups, from industry and academia. And as we get into some of these issues, I think it's going to be really important to hear from the stakeholders and to be able to digest some of that information, some of that feedback. When it comes to global competition, there's, I think the country that best embraces the ethical use of artificial intelligence is really going to be the leader and to be best positioned economically going into the future. I think it's those countries that are going to have the most benefit. And I think this commission can really, I hope, will help position the United States to be that leader and to be best positioned to benefit from artificial intelligence. It's when I talk about regulating fairly, as a Republican, lots of folks in my party, including me, sometimes look with skepticism at government regulation. So many government regulations sometimes really serve to stifle innovation and stifle investment in new technology rather than helping to encourage it. But the flip side of that is some regulations are really important to help provide certainty, to help provide a framework for industry to have transparency and to be able to make new investments and new innovations with confidence that the government's not going to come and change the rules on them or punish them somehow. So having that regulatory framework in a fair way is really important, and I think that's going to be really important when it comes to artificial intelligence. And when it comes to our workforce, there are a lot of challenges in our workforce today. There's a lot of uncertainty, and as technology advances in our economy and the nature of jobs change, I think it's going to be really important to make sure that artificial intelligence and the advances that it brings and the advantages that it brings doesn't serve the other purpose of leaving some people behind. I think we have to make sure that we are preparing our workforce, investing in our workforce to make sure that artificial intelligence really benefits everybody.
Well, I think you bring up a good point, Congressman Ferguson, about how this commission is going to really go out and try to get input from different stakeholders and different members of the community across the country, whether it's civil rights groups, whether it's the business community. And on that first meeting on March 10th in Austin, at the Austin Chamber, I think we're going to get our first taste of really getting a chance to see what the public has to think about artificial intelligence. Speaking of convening, though, Representative Delaney, you were the founding member of the AI caucus on Capitol Hill, and were the lead sponsor of the Future of AI Act in the House. What sparked your interest in AI policy?
Well, it struck me, and again, as someone who came from the private sector prior to serving and having the privilege of serving in government, it struck me that one of the things that government was lagging in was thinking about the future. And that's something that the private economy actually does quite well, which is to think about the future, think about where the world is going, and steer your business to hopefully be successful in that new world. And that was sorely lacking in government. And in many ways, when you would go into the private sector, all they were talking about is how kind of the technological transition towards a future where AI, machine learning, and other advanced computing technologies were reshaping their industry, and they were preparing for it. And none of that was happening in government. And it struck me as one of the most important things for us to be doing, yet we were doing none of it. And I think we've seen examples of that when technology companies or social media companies would come and testify in Congress, and it felt like the members of Congress were poorly equipped to even engage in the traditional kind of dialogue which leads to the policy making that they have to do. So that was the insight behind the AI caucus, which was to create an opportunity to convene leaders from the private sector, from public policy, from different stakeholders who were thinking about this for their communities, and to convene those groups and have that discussion in the Congress. And I think to some extent, that's why I'm so excited to be part of the commission, co-chair of the commission with Mike. And I'm excited for our first event in Austin, because I think it's a continuation of that work, because that's what we're really going to be doing. We're going to be listening, and we're going to be kind of digesting the inputs from all these different stakeholders, obviously the private sector, policymakers, people from government, a diverse group of people with different perspectives of how these technologies are impacting the communities that they care about, and coming up with recommendations, because it's critically important that the United States lead in artificial intelligence. And we come from this with such a position of strength. If you think about our innovation economy and how successful our government has historically been in partnering with our world-class universities and with the private sector in leading on innovation. The United States still, by any measure, at least in my judgment, is the leading innovation economy because of the rule of law that we have in this country and the fundamental freedoms that we have in this country. Those are kind of irreplaceable assets. However, other countries, particularly China, are making massive disproportionate investments. They have certain advantages that we don't want to have, right? They don't have privacy restrictions, and that's actually an advantage when you're trying to develop artificial intelligence capabilities. We don't actually want to compete on that, obviously. In my judgment, we need more privacy restrictions in this country. But we have to make sure that the United States has all the key tools and the environment it needs to be successful. We have to make sure our companies are competitive. We have to make sure the government's playing the appropriate role it needs to play, which is making investments in areas that the private sector fundamentally will never invest in because the return time frame is too long. And also that policymakers are thinking about kind of some of the things that Mike touched on, which is, the guardrails that we need to make sure that, importantly, some of the biases that we have in our society that we're working hard to eliminate in our society, that those don't get hardwired into the systems that will be making decisions in the future that impact so many of our lives. So there's privacy implications, there's inherent bias implications that need to be considered by policymakers so that we can kind of unleash the power of our innovation economy against advanced technologies like artificial intelligence, continue to lead the world in innovation, continue to produce the businesses that are the global leaders. All of that is fundamentally good for our economy, but do it in a way that safeguards the fundamental liberties and rights of our citizens. So, that's what the AI caucus was about. And to some extent, this commission, one of the reasons I'm excited about it is an opportunity to continue that work, partnering with the chamber and Mike.
Congressman Delaney, you're singing my tune about the need for a national privacy law, so I appreciate that. You did mention China a little bit, and China is heavily investing in artificial intelligence. They've put forward a plan highlighting their ambitions to become the world leader by 2030. Before the commission convenes, and I'll throw this question to both of you, Congressman Delaney and Congressman Ferguson, what are your thoughts on how the United States should lead?
Well, I guess I would just say that we are living in an increasingly competitive world. We are facing both economic and other geopolitical threats from competitors, and we see that in hostile actions taken by countries that are not necessarily our friends or our allies, and that's a real challenge for us. And it's a particular challenge when our country is somewhat divided, so to speak, on a number of different things, whether it's politics or culture or other things. So obviously, the more that we can work together in our country, the better off we'll be. But we also need to be able to recognize the competitive threats that are out there. And clearly, China, as you mentioned, wants to be the world dominator in every way. So it's going to be very, very important for us to be able to compete globally. And that's why I said earlier, when you talk about some of the main priorities of our commission, one of them has to be and will be, how do we compete globally on the global stage? And artificial intelligence is going to be a huge part of the future economic development of our world. And America has to be positioned to be a leader on that, or we will be left behind. And that will have a lot of negative implications in some ways certainly that we can't even think of at this point.
Congressman Delaney, Congressman Ferguson, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your leadership and for your role in this new bipartisan commission on AI, competitiveness, inclusion, and innovation. Now I'd like to welcome Myron Brilliant, Executive Vice President and Head of International Affairs here at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Hello, I'm Myron Brilliant. I'm the Executive Vice President in charge of International Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I hope you really enjoyed today's first installment in the Chamber's competition series on the competition for global leadership. Throughout this four-part series, we're exploring how competition propels our country and our world towards a brighter future of growth, solutions, and opportunities. As Suzanne Clark brilliantly laid out in the State of American Address, winning the future means competing in global markets and competing for global leadership. But by one vital measure, trade, we're standing still, and that means we're falling behind. We cannot afford to sit on the sidelines. We hope today's event has offered insight onto how the Chamber is making a difference, how we're working to turn this around with all the help of our member companies. The United States needs to get back in the game in a big way on trade. We've got to make a difference. This means negotiating new market opening trade agreements. It means setting a strategy with regard to China that allows American companies to compete in that large and growing market. But we've got a challenge, and I want to underscore this. China's unfair trading and regulatory practices. They're numerous, they're problematic, and they undermine confidence in China's leadership. And we need to address the heavy burden of tariffs this administration inherited. Tariffs are taxes paid by Americans and a burden on U.S. competitiveness. We cannot simply accept them as an immutable reality. Separately, you also heard today that the Chamber's Cyber Intelligence and Security Division will continue to grapple with national security challenges to businesses. This was laid out brilliantly by Chris Roberti as he moderated a discussion with Mike Morrell today. We also addressed today the Chamber's Supply Chain Working Group, which will continue to work with stakeholders from all corners of American business to address port congestion and other continuing challenges facing our supply chains. And on artificial intelligence, we'll help you engage with the Chamber's Technology Engagement Center, including Jordan Crenshaw, who runs it, as it launches a commission on artificial intelligence competitiveness, inclusion, innovation to develop solutions for the United States to lead in AI. Join us next week, same time, same day, for the second installment in our competition series, Competition in the Marketplace, Ensuring a Level Playing Field for Business. That's Tuesday, January 25th at 11 a.m. Let me repeat that. Tuesday, January 25th at 11 a.m. We'll turn the focus to the need to preserve free market dynamism in the economy, and it will include speakers such as FTC Commissioner Noah Phillips. Thank you for joining today's session and have a great day. Please give us your feedback. Thank you very much.